I'm not the type of person who believes in coincidence, much less in destiny. Life taught me early on that nothing comes easy, and that expecting too much from things only leads to frustration. My name is Sophia, and since I was 15, I've been living a routine that many people would call survival. When my mother got sick, everything turned upside down. I dropped out of school and traded my notebooks for the old sewing machine we had at home. Since then, sewing has become my world, not out of passion, but out of necessity. Each dress I made was one less bill to worry about. Each stitch, each hem, was another breather for my mother to continue her treatment. We lived in a small apartment, with inherited furniture and a refrigerator that was noisier than cold. But even so, every night, after cleaning everything and watching my mother fall asleep on the couch, I would take out my old notebook and draw. It wasn't to sell. It was just for me, because deep down, I was still a girl who dreamed of something bigger, even without knowing if I would ever have the chance. That day started like any other. Strong sun, tired body, deliveries in hand. I had already crossed the city with 2 bags full of dresses, and still had 1 more delivery to go. The heat made me stop. I allowed myself a small luxury. I went into a cafe downtown, where I usually only passed by the window. It was cool, quiet, full of well-dressed people working on expensive computers and drinking coffee with complicated names. I sat in the corner, ordered the cheapest option on the menu, and took out my notebook. I started to draw, trying to forget for a moment about the accumulated bills and the almost running out of medicine. I was so distracted that I didn't even notice the man coming in. He seemed out of place in that environment, even though he was perfectly dressed for it. Expensive suit, firm posture, sure steps. He crossed the room as if everyone there was invisible. But they weren't. A waiter tripped right in front of him. He swerved abruptly and ended up bumping into my table. The coffee flew straight onto my notebook. I watched as the liquid stained my drawings. He said, "Sorry," curtly, without looking at me. He took a napkin, cleaned his own jacket, and left. And I stood there, watching my little escape valve turn into a brown puddle on the table. I gathered up the papers like someone picking up pieces of themselves. As silly as it may seem, that notebook was the only thing that still made me feel like I hadn't completely given up on myself. And seeing it ruined by someone who didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye left me with a bitter taste. I finished my cold coffee, without even tasting it, and went home with my head full. The neighborhood where I live is simple, one of those where the thin walls can't hold in even noise, much less secrets. When I got home, my mother was sleeping on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that must have been retired by now. I sat on the kitchen chair and stared at the wet notebook, trying to understand why it had affected me so much. It wasn't just the coffee, it was the neglect, the way he passed me by as if I were invisible, as if my world was worthless. And maybe I was starting to believe that too, that I wasn't worth it, that my life was just that, surviving, serving, disappearing. I didn't expect anything else from that day. I just wanted to take a shower, eat something, and try to sleep with a clear conscience. But then there was a knock on the door, and it was the kind of knock you feel in your chest before you hear it. When I opened it, I was faced with a woman who seemed completely out of place. Tall, elegant, impeccably dressed, holding a black folder like someone who's used to closing deals. She smiled, but it wasn't just any smile. It was calculated, precise. She asked if I was Sophia, and before I could lie or think, she said she worked with the man from the cafe. My heart raced. She pulled one of my drawings out of the folder, one of the few that had escaped the liquid tragedy, and said he was interested. I was speechless. It was so absurd in one sentence that I almost laughed. But then she continued. She said he wanted to make me a proposal. Something quick, no strings attached. I would pretend to be his fiancée for a weekend. In exchange, he would pay for my mother's treatment and also give me a considerable amount of money. I swear I thought it was a prank, but she spoke with such certainty that I began to doubt my own disbelief. At that moment, time seemed to stop. My head was spinning, trying to figure out if this was some kind of scam, if I was the victim of some strange prank, or if by some crazy twist of the universe, someone had actually noticed me in that cafe. The woman, Camilla, as she introduced herself, seemed to know more about me than I would have liked. She talked about my mother, about the difficult situation, about how this proposal could be a chance to change everything. It scared me. How could someone like her, connected to a man so far from my world, know so much? But when I looked at my mother sleeping, pale and fragile on the couch, it hit me. It wasn't about me. It was about her. About what I was willing to do to ensure that she had at least one more month of decent life. Accepting seemed crazy, but refusing seemed selfish. Camilla handed me a card with an address, said that they would be expecting me the next day at 10 a.m., and left as if this were just another task for the day. I stood there, with the card in my hand, and my heart beating in my throat, not knowing if this was a miracle in disguise or a well-laid trap. The night was long. I reread the card every 5 minutes, as if the golden letters were going to change. I couldn't sleep. My head was spinning, full of possible scenarios, and none of them seemed completely right. I tried to imagine what it would be like to be in that place, pretending something I'd never really experienced. Because, truth be told, I'd never even had a real boyfriend. I'd always been the daughter of Dona Marta, the seamstress, the one who barely had time to breathe. What story was I going to tell his family? How was someone like me going to convince a bunch of rich people who were used to another type of woman? The fear was real, but so was the hope. For the first time, there was a gap, a door half open that might lead me out of the same cycle. Deep down, I knew I had already decided. All I needed was the courage to admit it, and it came in the form of a sharp pain in my chest when I went to get my mother's last medicine and realized I had no more money. The pharmacy doesn't do charity. Life, even less so. The next day, at 9:45 a.m., I was already standing in front of the gate of the Montenegro mansion. The mansion looked like something out of a movie. Tall gates, a perfectly manicured garden, a facade that commanded respect even before a word was spoken. I felt small, out of place, as if I had invaded something that wasn't meant for me. Camilla was waiting for me at the entrance, looking just as elegant as the night before. She smiled with that same professional neutrality and guided me through the hallways of the house as if she were presenting a luxury catalog. We passed paintings that seemed to be worth more than everything I had in my apartment. The marble floor echoed with my hesitant steps, and with each room we walked through, I became more certain that this was another world. When we entered the living room where he was, I almost froze. Artur Montenegro was sitting in a leather armchair, next to a lit fireplace, as if he had been waiting in that exact position forever. He stood up as soon as he saw me and gestured for me to sit down. He didn't say much at first. He just observed me, like someone evaluating a piece of merchandise before closing the deal. I was trembling inside, but I maintained my composure. I couldn't show insecurity. Not there. He explained the proposal in a straightforward manner, as if he were hiring someone for a delivery service, a weekend, an important family event, pretending to be his fiancée. In exchange, he would pay off all my mother's medical debts and pay a reasonable amount. He said he needed someone outside his circle, someone without the social vices of the environment he lived in. He spoke as if I were a functional solution, not a person. But even with his cold and methodical manner, I could tell there was something behind it. A disguised fear, perhaps. A contained urgency. I took the contract he handed me with sweaty hands and skimmed it, without taking in much of it. I didn't understand the terms very well, but the promise was clear. I just had to appear to be in love with him for a few days. There would be no real involvement, no physical obligations, just presence, posture, performance. At that moment, I thought of my mother once again, of the destroyed notebook, of his indifferent look at the coffee shop. And despite all of that, I signed. Because at that moment, what guided me was not trust, it was necessity. Signing that contract was like jumping from a high place without knowing if there was a net underneath. Camilla, who had remained silent the whole time, took charge of the situation as soon as my signature dried on the paper. She handed me a folder with information that I had to memorize. Tastes, routine, details of the Montenegro family, and a schedule of the social commitments we would face. It was intense training, almost as if I were about to play the lead role in a play, only with a real audience and real consequences. I spent the following days immersed in a universe that until then only existed in the shop windows I saw from the outside. I learned how to behave at the table, how to smile with control, how to answer questions without revealing anything. Camilla was not only an assistant, she was a coach, a strategist, and sometimes even an executioner. Every mistake I made was pointed out coldly, but without rudeness. It was as if she was also protecting something bigger than I could understand at that moment. And even so, I was getting good at it. Fear still lived within me, but I began to understand that, to survive in that environment, I needed to be someone else. My first official appearance was at a dinner with part of his family. According to Camilla, it was a rehearsal so that I could get used to the stares and questions. I wore a dress she had chosen, sat in the posture we had rehearsed, and stood next to Arthur as if we already had a story. The feeling was surreal. He remained distant, speaking only when necessary, but always attentive to my every gesture, as if he were calculating how much I could handle. And it was that night that I met Donna Cecilia, his grandmother, an elegant woman, with a hard look in her eyes, who made no attempt to hide her judgment. When I was introduced, she looked at me, for a few seconds too long before saying in a firm voice, "She is simple," and she went back to looking at her plate. Arthur didn't react. He just kept eating, but I felt the impact like a slap. At that table, where the silverware was silver and the smiles all seemed rehearsed, I was a foreign body. And maybe that was exactly what he wanted. Someone outside the norm. The problem is that at that point, I didn't even know if I could keep up that farce until the end. In the following days, routine became heavier. In addition to the upcoming social commitments, I had to memorize information that would help me appear convincing. The place where we supposedly met, the date of the engagement, his favorite color, the dessert I was supposed to pretend to love because it was our favorite. Every detail was rehearsed with an almost cruel precision. Camilla said that the slightest mistake could generate distrust. And I knew that, in this game, any suspicion could cost everything. Meanwhile, Arthur continued to be a mystery. Outside of dinner, he spoke little, always polite, but cold. He never treated me badly, but he never opened up either. It was as if he wanted to keep a safe distance, as if he was used to controlling everything, including his feelings. I tried to decipher him, to understand why someone so closed off had made such an unusual proposal, but he never gave any clues. Sometimes, I caught myself watching him from afar, trying to catch some gesture that showed humanity, and every now and then, I found it, like the restrained way he clenched his fists when they talked about family, or the lost look that appeared for a few seconds before he turned his face away. It was in this context that Bianca appeared. According to Camilla, she was Arthur's ex-fiancée, the daughter of an influential family, the kind that knew exactly where and how to move in this world. She appeared suddenly, as if summoned by some hidden script. At the second important dinner I attended, there she was, entering as if she owned the place, dressed to kill and to dismantle me. Bianca didn't attack me directly. She threw barbs with smiles, asked questions with an air of curiosity, but with venom in her intonation. Did you already know the Montenegro world before you met Artur? Or have you chosen the wedding date yet? I hope you didn't forget Donna Cecilia's piano. She's very picky about ceremonies. I smiled and answered as if I had been trained, but inside I was eating away at her. She knew, or at least she suspected, and the way she looked at me made it clear that she wasn't going to make things easy. Arthur, as always, remained calm. Sometimes he would cut the subject short with a firm answer. Other times he would just observe in silence. But her presence turned everything into a minefield, and I was beginning to realize that this agreement went far beyond a simple act. Even with all the tension, something began to change between Arthur and me. First, our moments together were cold, mechanical, each gesture choreographed to seem natural. But as the days went by, there were small breaks in this rigidity. A spontaneous comment during dinner, a look that lingered longer than necessary, a pause between sentences, as if he were choosing his words better so as not to seem so distant. I didn't know what to think. Part of me still believed that it was all just work, a contract. But another part, the one that kept silently observing, began to notice cracks in his armor. They weren't obvious, but they were there. And for the first time, I realized that maybe he was acting too. Not just with me, but with everyone. It was as if the role of the successful, unflappable man was a mask he had worn for so long that he no longer knew how to take it off. This realization confused me, because until then, it had been easy to maintain emotional distance. But once I saw some truth in it, I began to wonder what else was real. The weekend of the big event arrived faster than I expected. Camilla prepared me even more rigorously than in the previous days. From the dress I would wear to the topics I should avoid, everything was planned. The event would take place in a mansion converted into a ballroom, where Artur would be one of the hosts. Everyone was there: family, business partners, politicians, journalists, and of course, Bianca. When we arrived, Artur held my hand more firmly than ever. "Today is important," he said, and it sounded less like a warning and more like a request. I walked into that crowded place with him and did what I had learned: smile without exaggeration, greet people politely, respond confidently. But the atmosphere was oppressive. Each person there seemed to be evaluating my posture, my appearance, my vocabulary. I felt tested every second. And when Bianca approached, I knew I would be the biggest one. She looked at me as if examining a fake piece of clothing, and with that sweet voice full of venom, she said, "So it's you, the bride." I swallowed hard and smiled, answering with the calm I had trained. "Yes, soon, officially." For the first time, I saw her lose her balance a little, and that's when I realized I was starting to learn the game. For the rest of the night, I continued to play the role with everything I had learned. I answered questions without seeming memorized. I smiled at the right moments. I showed affection without exaggeration. Artur, on the other hand, seemed more relaxed than ever. He even tried to make a joke or two between performances, something I had never seen from him before. I didn't know if it was part of the show or if, somehow, my presence was really making a difference. What I felt was a strange lightness in the midst of that chaos, and for a moment, just for a moment, I managed to forget that it was all an act. When the night was over, Artur walked me to the car with a different silence. He seemed satisfied. Before opening the door for me, he said, "You were better than I expected." There was no emotion in his voice, but the way he held my arm for a second longer than necessary said otherwise. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling of crossing an invisible line between a lie and something that could be real. On the way back, I found myself thinking, what if, in the midst of so much acting, we had created something real without realizing it? The next day, everything seemed different. Not in the house, nor in the people, but in me. I woke up with a strange desire to see Artur, to talk to him without the rehearsed scripts, without Camilla's constant supervision, and almost as if he had read my thoughts, he called me to his office for a chat. When I entered, he was looking out the window, as he always did when he wanted to think. He offered me a chair and sat down across from me, his expression less rigid than usual. He said there was something I needed to know, and then, without embellishment, he confessed that the contract with me was not just to dispel suspicions or reassure his grandmother. There were external pressures, rivals trying to destabilize his position in the company, veiled threats against the Montenegro name. The idea of an unexpected bride was a strategic move to show strength and stability. But, according to him, I went beyond what was expected. "You brought truth to a place where everything is appearance," he said. I didn't know what to say. I stood there listening, while he undressed himself emotionally, for the first time. And when I realized, I was looking at him with different eyes, no longer as the cold man who spilled coffee on my notebook, but as someone who also needed a hug, peace, someone who saw who he really was. After that conversation, I began to see everything with different eyes. The walls of the mansion no longer seemed so oppressive, and even the long, silent hallways began to seem less cold. It was as if, by revealing a piece of his truth, Artur had broken something inside me. Too, a resistance, a barrier that I didn't even know I had. We began to talk more, even if it was between one meeting and another, or during the silent breakfasts that had previously been just protocol. He asked me what I thought about certain subjects. He wanted to hear my opinions, even if sometimes he didn't agree. That was new to me. No one had ever cared about what I thought beyond what I could stitch together. And, as much as I constantly reminded myself that it all started as an agreement, it was impossible to ignore the closeness that was beginning to emerge. Of course, the contract still existed. The rules were still there, but something outside of the agreement was being born, and I was afraid to name it. Because naming, for me, has always meant attachment. And attachment, in my world, almost always ends in loss. It was on one of those gray mornings with the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee on the table that Camilla appeared with an envelope in her hand and an expression I had never seen on her face: concern. She said she needed to speak to me and Artur in private. We went up to the office together, and she explained, bluntly, that Bianca was trying to expose the engagement. She had obtained documents, cross-referenced information, gathered evidence that could expose that it was all a setup. At that moment, I felt the ground disappear from under my feet. What would happen if everything came to light? Would it be the end of the agreement? And more than that, what did that mean to me now that I no longer knew how to separate what was paper and what was feeling? Artur was silent for a few seconds. Then he got up and started pacing the room, which he always did when he needed to think in a hurry. He said he couldn't allow Bianca to destroy everything, that she didn't just want to hurt him, but also use it all against the family, against the company. For the first time, he seemed nervous, and it was there that I realized that if before I was just part of a strategy, now I was part of a much bigger and much more dangerous game than I had imagined. In the days that followed, the mood in the mansion changed. Camilla became even more discreet, but it was clear that she was constantly monitoring something. Artur, although he tried to maintain his routine, seemed more tense. And I, who until then had been just a piece in a sophisticated chess game, began to feel the real weight of being involved in that story. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about my mother, or about money, or about a deal. Now there were real risks. There were reputations, companies, inheritances at stake. Bianca, by all indications, was waiting for the right moment to strike, and her fear wasn't due to jealousy or hurt pride. It was strategic. She wanted to destabilize everything, to show that Artur was fragile, manipulable, and I, in her eyes, was the weakest piece, the easiest to hit. Camilla even suggested that I step away from the scene for a few days, but Artur refused right away. He said that backing out now would be confirming everything Bianca wanted to prove, and at that moment, even though I was shaking inside, I decided to stay. Not because of a contractual obligation, but because I was already up to my neck in it, and leaving no longer seemed like an option. It was during a more informal dinner, with fewer guests and a seemingly light atmosphere, that Bianca made her move. She appeared out of nowhere, as if she had just passed by chance, and sat at the table without being invited. Artur kept his composure. Camilla pretended to be normal, but I knew it was a trap. She started with small talk, talking about travels and memories from the time when she frequented that house more freely. Then she said the phrase that silenced everyone at the table. "Are you sure, Artur, that she is prepared for everything this world demands? Because honestly, it seems to me that she is still learning the rules." Silence was immediate. I felt my face burn, but I maintained my composure. I took a deep breath and answered, looking her straight in the eyes. "Maybe I am learning, but sometimes those who come from the outside see what those who live here have long forgotten how to see." Bianca forced a smile and looked away. Artur squeezed my hand lightly under the table. I didn't say anything, but that gesture was more than enough. For the first time, I had faced Bianca, and for the first time, I felt like maybe I really belonged there. After that night, something changed between us. Not only between me and Bianca, who started to avoid me like someone who is suspicious of something she can no longer control, but mainly between me and Artur. He started to see me differently, not as someone who needed to be trained or protected, but as someone who could walk alongside him. Our moments together started to happen more frequently and less rehearsed. Sometimes, he would call me to talk in the library, without rushing, just to share family memories, childhood stories, or doubts about difficult decisions. In these conversations, I got to know a side of him that almost no one saw. The Artur who lost a sister when he was young and carried that pain in silence. The one who felt pressured to be impeccable so as not to disappoint his grandmother. The one who lived surrounded by people who flattered him, but constantly felt alone. And it was in this process that, without realizing it, We stopped, acting. Our hands met naturally. Our glances lasted longer than necessary, and our words came less calculated. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew it wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. Even so, I was still scared, because while the connection grew, the contract still existed. It was there, kept in a drawer, reminding us that it all had an artificial origin. Sometimes before going to sleep, I would find myself wondering if everything that was happening wasn't just part of a more elaborate game. What if he was just playing the role of a vulnerable man because it was part of the plan? What if I was confusing kindness with affection? These were thoughts that haunted me, especially on the nights when I returned to my room alone after a dinner full of touches and looks. At those times, I remembered Sophia, who took care of her mother on the couch, the one who ran to the pharmacy trying to haggle over the price of a medicine, and I wondered what she would say if she saw where I was now. Would she call me foolish or brave? I had no answer, but I knew I no longer wanted to live in a space where everything was pretend. Not with him. Not after everything we had built, even if it had started as a contract. Things got worse when Camilla showed up a few days later with another envelope. She called Artur in for a private chat, and later that afternoon, they both called me into the office. The tension in the air was evident. Camilla handed me the envelope without saying anything. Inside were copies of emails and photos that suggested Bianca was still trying to bring us down. Only this time, there was a difference. Someone from the Montenegro family itself was helping her. Artur remained silent for a long time, staring at the papers as if he were trying to identify the betrayal with his eyes. When he finally spoke, he didn't shout or blame anyone. He simply said in a firm voice that this couldn't go on. If we keep acting like it was all just a contract, she'll get it, because there's no truth in lies, and that's what she wants to prove. That hit me hard. It was as if he was inviting me, not just to stay, but to make all of this real. And as I sat there with the documents in my hands, I realized that I was also tired of pretending. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start living something that actually included me. That night, Artur invited me to talk in the library, a place that had already become our informal refuge. He didn't speak, with the distant tone he had before. He spoke calmly, as if he knew the weight of the words he was about to use. I hired you because I needed a quick solution, but you became much more than that, Sophia. You became my peace, and I felt my heart tighten in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He came closer, held my hands gently, and said that from then on, he no longer wanted us to proceed based on a contract. He wanted to know what I wanted. No obligation, no pressure, just the truth. And for the first time, I realized that I could choose. It was no longer a question of need. It was a question of wanting. And I wanted it. I wanted him. I wanted that new chapter. I wanted to see where it could take us, if we had the courage to be honest. Then, looking into his eyes, I said, I'll stay. But this time, not because I have to, because I choose to. After that night, everything changed. And it wasn't a drastic cinematic change. In the small gestures, in the way he started calling me by name more softly, in the care he took in including my favorite tea in my breakfast, in the way he started listening to me with real interest, not as part of a protocol. Camilla, who had always been neutral, also changed. She started treating me with more respect, almost as if she recognized that I had stopped being a piece on the board and became someone who was really there, by merit, by presence. The house employees also started to act differently, and Donna Cecilia, despite her stern look, no longer threw me those phrases full of disdain. It was as if, little by little, I was being accepted. But more than that, it was as if I was accepting myself in that place. As if, for the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be there, not as an extra, but as part of the plot. Bianca, on the other hand, disappeared. After her last attempts to manipulate the situation failed, she disappeared from the site, house, and the circle. There was no scandal, no goodbye, just silence. Camilla commented that she had lost strength, and that sometimes the greatest punishment for people like her is simply to be ignored. I didn't ask anymore. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to move forward without looking back, and that's what we did. Artur began to reorganize his schedule to include more moments just for us. Sometimes we would go for walks in the gardens of the property. Other times we would watch old movies in a hidden room in the mansion that no one else used. He would show me parts of his life that he had never shared with anyone, and I, little by little, let him see parts of me that until then had been hidden under the hardship of survival. My hands, accustomed to sewing in silence, now touched his skin with affection, and my heart, so accustomed to clenching with fear, began to learn the rhythm of trust. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, with all the imperfections and scars, but it was ours. Sometime later, Arthur took me to see a space in the company where he was investing in a new project, something more human, as he himself said. It was an initiative aimed at young people in vulnerable situations to learn practical skills, including sewing. When we entered that room full of machines, fabrics, and attentive teenagers, I felt something strange, belonging. He introduced me as someone very special, with a story of strength and talent, and for the first time I saw myself through his eyes. At that moment, I realized that everything I had been through, all the hardship, all the pain, had indeed shaped me, but not nullified me. I was still there, whole, even if with patches. And the most beautiful thing was realizing that he saw value in these patches. After the visit, he asked me if I would like to coordinate that space, to help structure the courses. It was so unexpected that I didn't even know what to say. But he didn't pressure me. He just said, "Think about it, calmly. What you have experienced has more value than you imagine." That night, before going to sleep, I sat on the porch of the mansion with a hot tea in my hands and looked up at the dark sky. So much had changed. And at the same time, it was as if everything was just going back to the right place. It wasn't about luxury or mansions. It was about finding a life where I could breathe without fear, about loving without having to beg for space, about taking care of my mother with dignity and, most importantly, taking care of myself. Because for years I only existed for others, for need, for desperation. And now, with Arthur, I was relearning how to be. And I won't lie, it was scary. Fear of losing, of everything being temporary, of someone waking up and saying it was over. But I was willing to live with that fear if, in exchange, I could truly live. There, on that silent porch, with the distant sound of the sleeping house, I understood that life hadn't gone back to normal. It had truly begun, for the first time. In the days that followed, I began to divide my time between household chores and visits to the social project. That gave me a new kind of energy, something I no longer remembered what it was like to feel. I saw in the eyes of those young people the same mix of fear and desire that once existed in me, and seeing how they transformed as they learned, as they saw themselves being useful, gave me a silent pride. Arthur accompanied me whenever he could. Sometimes he just watched, other times he sat next to me, as if that space also healed him in some way. It was strange to think that this man, who had previously seemed so distant and inaccessible, was now part of my daily life so naturally. We still had differences, many, but now there was a bridge between our worlds, a bridge made of listening, of care, of presence, and to my surprise, Donna Cecilia was the next to cross that bridge. She called me in for a chat, alone, in her room, a space I had never set foot in before. I sat in an armchair across from her, tense, as if I were about to be evaluated, and maybe I was. But what came was not judgment. It was something more complex. She began by saying that she had resisted my presence from the beginning, that she thought it was all cheap theater, and that, for a while, she still believed that. But over time, observing my gestures, my way of dealing with the house, with Arthur, with the others, she began to see something that surprised her. Truth. You didn't try to impress anyone, Sophia, and that's what made me pay attention. That broke me down inside, not because I needed her approval, but because it was confirmation that, even without having played her game, I had won. When I left that room, something inside me felt lighter. For the first time, I felt that my story was no longer just being tolerated there. It was being accepted. Shortly after that conversation with Donna Cecilia, Arthur invited me to take a walk in the garden of the house. It was late afternoon. The sun was low, tinting the sky with an orange hue that made everything seem calmer. We walked in silence for a few minutes, until he stopped near an old tree where he usually sat when he wanted to think. There, without beating around the bush, he told me that he had canceled the contract, that he had personally gone to his lawyer, who had torn up the copy kept in the safe and asked that it be removed from any files, because it doesn't make sense anymore. He said, "None of this needs paper anymore. If it's going to continue, it has to be because we both want it, and that's it." I stood there, still, with that information throbbing in my head. It had been a long time since the contract had guided our steps, but knowing that he had officially ended it without even consulting me showed how willing he was to start over without crutches. And for the first time, I realized that we were truly free to build something new, or, if we wanted, to stop there. But I didn't want to stop, and I don't think he did either. We kept walking to the lowest part of the property, where there was a small greenhouse that he barely used. It was a simple place, without the pomp of the rest of the mansion, with the smell of wet earth and plants growing somewhat out of order. And it was there, in that somewhat forgotten place, that he asked me if I wanted to stay, not with a ring, not with crazy promises, just with life, with the routine, with the conversations, with the good days and the bad. "If you want to leave, I understand," he said, "but if you want to stay, I want to try this with you, for real." My eyes filled with tears, not because of cheap emotion, but because that was the most honest request anyone had ever made to me. And in that simple place, far from the salons and contracts, I said yes. Not the yes of a happy ending, but the yes of someone who knows that it will be hard work, that they will be afraid, that they will need to learn from each other every day, but who still chooses to try. And there began what I call, today, real life. After that day in the greenhouse, we began to divide our days in a way that seemed less rehearsed and more spontaneous. There were no more secret meetings with Camilla, no more script adjustments. We simply woke up, had coffee together, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing at silly things, and let life happen. Artur continued to be the serious, methodical man, sometimes even difficult to understand. But now, he allowed himself to show his flaws. He told me when he made a mistake in a decision, when he doubted himself, when he was afraid of disappointing those who trusted him. And that, for me, was the greatest gesture of love, vulnerability. In return, I also let go of parts of the armor that life had forced me to wear for so many years. I stopped hiding my insecurities, pretending that I didn't feel small in certain situations. He listened to me, he validated me, and he did his best not to let his world swallow me up. It was difficult, of course. Sometimes I found myself in silence, still waiting for it all to fall apart. But when I remembered that it was now a choice, not a necessity, the fear lessened. My mother also felt this change. She, who was still part of my routine, was now being cared for with more dignity. Her medications were always up to date, her diet was lighter, and her checkups were more frequent. And best of all, she started to smile again. One day, out of the blue, she said to me, "Your eyes have a sparkle again, my daughter." That broke me, because for a long time, I had forgotten what it was like to look at myself in the mirror without guilt, without exhaustion. Seeing that she noticed this gave me the strength to carry on. And Artur, even with his busy schedule and the never-ending pressure, made a point of being present. He would come to visit my mother, bring flowers, sit on the couch to drink coffee, and chat, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He never tried to buy her affection. He just offered his presence. And over time, she also began to see something in him beyond his name and status. She began to see the man. And when she held my hand and said she was okay with seeing me there, with him, I knew I didn't need any approval anymore. Just the certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The consolidation came silently, like water slowly filling the corners of a container. There was no announcement, no party, no fanfare. But suddenly, everyone seemed to know that I was no longer a hired hand. I was someone who was there because I wanted to be, and because I was loved. The team at the company started calling me by name more intimately, asking me questions about my day-to-day life, including me in conversations without the formal filter that existed before. Camilla, who had always been tough and objective, started sharing her concerns about the company and her life with me. She started to see me as an ally, or maybe even as a friend. And Arthur, he didn't need to say much. It was in his gestures. Like when he put my name on the list of administrators for the social project, without consulting me, but with the certainty that I would like it. Or when he asked me to represent the company alongside him at a charity event, even though he knew that it would bring questions and headlines. He no longer hid it. And, in a way, I was no longer hiding from myself either. But like everything in life, there were also difficult days, moments when insecurity hit hard, when the difference between our worlds made itself felt. I didn't stop being who I am. I continued to be Dona Marta's daughter, the girl who taught herself to sew, the woman who still gets scared when someone says, "You deserve to be here." And sometimes that weighed on me, especially when we met people who treated me with condescension, who pretended to be friendly, but looked at me with judgment. At those times, Arthur gave me space. He didn't try to solve things for me, but he always told me firmly, "You're not here because of me. You're here because of who you are." That was enough. And little by little, those phrases became part of me, like invisible patches that reinforce the torn parts of my self-esteem. It wasn't easy, but it was possible, because now I had someone to share the burden with, and, perhaps for the first time, I felt part of something that was more than an emergency plan. It was a life under construction, a real life. Time passed, and with it came the calm that only constancy brings. There were no longer any tests or trials to overcome. What had once been effort became routine, and what had once been fear became intimacy. I began to renovate my studio with Arthur's help, not as a gift, but as a partnership. He wanted me to get back to my projects, my drawings, my identity. We started talking about the old notebook again, the one that had been stained by the coffee. One day, unexpectedly, he showed up with a simply wrapped gift. It was the notebook restored by an artisanal bookbinder, with each page preserved in the best possible way. He said, "This is how it all started, right?" And at that moment, without glamour or audience, I cried, because that gesture said much more than flowers or promises. It said, "I saw you from the beginning, and I care." I placed the notebook on the most visible shelf in the new space, not as a trophy, but as a living reminder that even the silliest accidents can be the beginning of something we never imagined we would experience. We decided to make our relationship official with a small event, just for the people who were truly part of the process. No magazine coverage, no gossip columns, just the closest ones, people who cheered us on, who respected the timing of things. Camilla was there, Donna Cecilia was there too. My mother, dressed in a dress I had sewn myself, held my hand as if she still couldn't believe it was real, and I understand. Because looking back, it seems like a miracle the path life took to bring me there. The ceremony was simple, in the mansion's garden, among flowers and silences that said more than speeches. When Arthur took my hand and looked into my eyes, he didn't make impossible promises. He simply said, "Let's keep building." And that was all I needed to hear. Because for someone who spent their whole lives trying to keep everything going alone, sharing the construction with someone is already the greatest symbol of love. And at that moment, with my bare feet on the grass and my heart light, I knew that what started as an act became reality. Not overnight, but brick by brick. And that was the best part. Today, looking back, I still wonder how something so unlikely happened to me. I, the girl who sewed in the dim light of the kitchen, who hid behind her drawings so as not to fall apart, ended up finding not only love, but a new way of existing. And it all started with a spilled coffee. Sometimes, when I say this out loud, even I doubt it. But it's true. Nothing was easy. There was fear, doubt, shame, a desire to give up. There were days when I felt like an imposter, sitting at tables that didn't seem made for me. But there was also courage, acceptance, partnership. And it was in those moments that I rebuilt myself, little by little, without rushing, and with Arthur by my side. Not like a Prince Charming who came to save me, but like someone who chose to stay even when he saw me whole, with scars, with flaws, with truths that the world often prefers to ignore. I don't know how our story will end, and honestly, I've stopped trying to control it. Life has taught me that some things just happen, without explanation, without a script. But I know one thing. I'm no longer the same Sophia who signed that contract out of desperation. Today I choose. I choose to be with someone out of love. I choose to take care of my mother with dignity, I choose to design dresses even if no one buys them. And above all, I choose to keep believing that we can start over, even if it seems late, even if it seems unlikely. Because what we lived through wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. And maybe that's why it was so beautiful. Because it came with sweat, with fear, with choice. And because even today, when I wake up and see him looking at me in silence while I drink my coffee, I remember that it all started with a banal accident, but one that showed me, for the first time, that I could also be chosen. For real.